Thanks so much for being here, Andrew. I just wanted to ask you, I understand that you became a Christian whilst you were studying natural sciences at Cambridge University, and then you went on to do a PhD in neuroscience. Could you tell us a bit more about your background and that sort of thing? Where did your fascination with science start?
I got going with science because my stepfather was a scientist, and he used to describe these amazing experiments he got up to as a child with chemicals that sadly you can't buy as legally on the internet as you could in his day. But there was one particular thing I really was desperate to make. So he described this thing called nitrogen triiodide, which is a substance that's so unstable that it explodes on touch. And he used to make some and then spread it thinly on the windowsill and then wait for the cat. And we thought this sounded amazing, and we were desperate to make it, but you couldn't make it because you need iodine crystals, which are a registered poison, and you're not allowed. But then my opportunity came when I was 17, I think, 18, and I went to Singapore to volunteer teaching in a school there. And in those days in Singapore, you could buy iodine crystals. So I bought some and I ground them up and mixed them with ammonia and filtered it and made some nitrogen triiodide and took it into school. Well, I made it in the school. But because I'd never made it before, I didn't realize quite how powerful it was. And I made a little bit too much of it. So I did actually detonate an explosion in a school, but fortunately wasn't arrested. I think if you did it nowadays, you'd be on a watch list, wouldn't you? But that began my fascination with chemistry. And in fact, there'll be a little bit of chemistry this evening. I've got some chemicals with me right here.
Well, we're glad it didn't go too wrong. I mentioned this book already that you've published recently. Are you sure? Are you 100% sure you want to be an agnostic? I just wonder what made you write a book like this.
Because I want to ask you that question provocatively. I think a lot of my friends are agnostics. They're not dogmatically atheistic. They're not against my belief in Jesus, but they're not particularly interested either. They're just somewhere on the fence. And maybe you are as well if you're tuning into this little broadcast, and I want to persuade you to think again. And that's what I'm going to try and do later today.
Great. Well, thanks, Andrew. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And just before I do hand the time over to you, let me explain how the Q&A is going to work. We want people to have a chance to ask you questions. So on the screen now, or in a minute, or in the description, if you're watching on YouTube, you can look at the description. There should be a link where you can submit questions. And you can do that anytime from now. And you don't need to wait till the end. There's no need to sign up or give your name. Just type your question. It'll be recorded. Please do submit your questions. And then after Andrew has finished speaking, I'll put some of those questions to him at the end. Okay, Andrew, over to you.
Thanks very much. Better not to be dogmatic. No one likes a crazed fanatic. Here's a boy who's got his wits. On the fence, that's where he sits, saying no one's right or wrong. Maybe, baby, maybe, baby. That's the chorus of the Wise Agnostic song. Buddha, Allah, I don't care. He's to say what God is there. I love Man U, she loves Spurs. I've got my truth, she's got hers. We don't need to disagree. Maybe, baby. Maybe, baby. That's what I say to your Christianity. Well, that isn't an actual song, but it's a song as I imagine it, written by an agnostic, someone who's on the fence and maybe just seems the safest thing to say. The word agnosticism, it just means I don't know. So the Greek word gnosis means knowledge, and you put an A in front of a Greek word and it means not. So, for example, we say something's asymmetrical when it's not symmetrical, or it's atypical when it's not typical. You could describe someone who was vegetarian as an acarnivore, or someone who doesn't like bagpipes, you could say was a-Scottish. If Gnosticism is about knowing things, then agnosticism is about not knowing things. It just means I don't know. But I don't know just seems like an increasingly common and respectable place to be. The British Social Attitude Survey, it's held every year, I think, but one every 10 years, they do a question on religion. They found in 1998 that 17% of the British population thought of themselves as non-religious. By 2018, this had risen to 44%. So it's like over doubled in 10 years, people who don't identify with any fixed religion. Although when you explore what those non-religious people believe, you find that lots of them believe actually quite religious things. So of the non-religious, 47%, almost half, think of themselves as being spiritual. 35%, about a third, believe in God or some kind of higher power. 34% believe in life after death. So it's not that people are atheists, they're just not willing to sort of nail their colours to any particular religious masts. Because after all, when people are too sure about something, we're a bit suspicious of them in our society. It just sounds arrogant, doesn't it, to say I'm right and everyone else is wrong. I mean, how do you know you're right? Wouldn't it be better just to say, I don't know? And doesn't people being too sure that they're right lead to wars with other people that are also too sure that they're right? Whereas if we could be humble enough to say, I don't know, it would be much more peaceful. And so there are lots of people in our world today who identify as agnostics, and there are some famous ones. So, for example, you've got in the world of actors, you have Leonardo DiCaprio or Charlie Chaplin. In the world of authors, you have Franz Kafka, if you're into literary things, or Matt Groening, if you like The Simpsons. If you're into philosophy, then Noam Chomsky or David Hume. If you're into science, then Marie Curie or Charles Darwin. All of these people sort of somewhere on the fence. They're not saying yes, definitely right, or no, definitely wrong. They're just, I don't know. I think the comedian Marcus Brigstock maybe puts it best. He says this: the truth, as I see it, is that I'd rather stay in a place of confusion amongst similar restless souls shuffling about in the hope there might be a sign pointing in one direction or another, than leap aboard whichever bandwagon looks like it's got some momentum behind it and a confident driver. We might find God. We should probably have a plan for that in case we startle him and he goes for us. I don't mind if we don't find him. I'd be just as happy to discover that whatever road this is that I'm on, I'm not walking it alone. Well, whatever your starting point, I'm hoping tonight to challenge your agnosticism. And to start with, I want to say that people can be agnostic in different ways. So, for example, you could be agnostic because something is knowable, but you yourself don't know it. So I could say I'm agnostic about the role of the inferior colliculus in the brain in ventriloquism. Now, I did a PhD in neuroscience years ago, and I was quite interested in this, and I did some reading, but I haven't kept up with the reading in the last 20 years, and so I don't know what the latest the scientists have found is, and so I don't know. Now, I could know. I could go on the internet and read some scientific papers. I could maybe do some more experiments, but I haven't done the research, and so I'm agnostic. In a similar vein, my co-author John says he's agnostic about how many balloons it would take to send his wife Aileen into space. I mean, it would be possible to know. It's quite a simple experiment, actually. Just attach one balloon. No, she's still on the Earth. Attach two, attach three, attach four. Oh, there she goes. There's the answer. But he's agnostic because he hasn't checked, and because he loves Aileen and she's scared of heights, it doesn't seem particularly kind to find out. And so he's agnostic. And it might be that you're agnostic about Jesus in that sense. You don't know because you've just never checked. You've never looked into it. So I'd made up my mind as a teenager about Jesus from a couple of uninspiring RE classes that I wasn't especially interested in, and a documentary I watched on Channel 4. And that was the only research I'd done. And maybe you're in a similar position. And in which case, I hope to persuade you tonight, it would be at least worth doing the research about Jesus to make up your mind. Maybe you're agnostic because you've never researched it. Why not research it? And one of the best things you could do would be to read some of the first century biographies of Jesus that are found in the Christian Bible, just to see what did the people who actually met Jesus think about him. That might be a good place to start. But other people are more dogmatically agnostic. For them, it's not so much I don't know as we can't know. But wait a second, because these people actually aren't very agnostic about their own agnosticism. They're kind of saying, I know that you can't know. And I want to say, well, how are you so sure that you can't be sure? To say, I know there's not enough evidence for God is like saying, I know there's no treasure hidden in Leicestershire. I mean, how could you know that? You'd have to have dug everywhere. What if there was a gold ingot hidden underneath an inconspicuous cabbage field, or a pearl necklace inside a detergent bottle? at a postcode that the police haven't checked yet. I mean, to say that you know that something doesn't exist means you'd have to have dug everywhere. Let's face it, the University of Leicester Archaeological Services, who do more digging than the rest of us, didn't even know until recently that the bones of King Richard III were under their local car park. To say that you know that evidence for God doesn't exist or there's not enough is a claim to have researched every avenue of philosophy, and you haven't done that, and so you don't know. So that's a kind of more dogmatic and I think silly agnosticism. But then there's a third kind. There's I don't know, I haven't checked. There's you can't know. Don't be so silly. But the third one I think is the most common, and that's the I don't want to know. Leave me alone. Right. So agnosticism is more of a kind of strategy to avoid arriving at the truth, because I'm just concerned it just might be inconvenient. It might be a hassle. I mean, it's born out of the suspicion that Christianity, if it's true, it could just really wreck my life. This is a suspicion I had at university. I tried to keep the whole thing at arm's length for fear that, well, let's be honest, if Christianity had a colour, it would be grey. If you could summarize the Christian ethic in a word, it would be don't. Christianity means ill-advised fashion choices, socks and sandals. It means evenings in watching nothing but songs of praise back to back on VHS. If it means parties where the only drink you serve is Schlur, which one of my friends rather unkindly calls Christian champagne. Maybe that's your view of Jesus. You just think he's anti-joy. And so you just want to avoid finding out if it's true, because if there is a God, then what a drag. And so we try to keep it at bay. Now, I want to say that actually, I think that is fake news about Jesus. I think actually he's very much more interesting than that, and very much more pro-joy than that. One of my friends described his surprise at reading of Jesus' first miracle, where he turned water into wine like this. Here's some water, and there we are. And if you wonder how I did that, this is not wine, and I wouldn't recommend you drink it. This is chemistry, and it's actually quite a strong laxative. So anyway, but it wasn't that Jesus turning water into wine that surprised him, because, you know, if Jesus is God, why shouldn't he do some unusual chemistry? The surprise for him was that Jesus wasn't instead going around the world turning all the wine into water. I mean, he had a view of Jesus that his greatest fear was that someone somewhere in the universe might be having too much fun, and Jesus was out to stamp it out. But actually, Jesus isn't anti-wine. I mean, if God is the creator of everything, if Jesus made the world, then he made wine. You know, there's a reason why it's enjoyable to drink. And sure, the Bible's against drunkenness, but then I am as well, because a very close friend of mine was an alcoholic and died tragically early, leaving behind 2 children. I mean, alcohol, if it's abused, it can cause a lot of pain and suffering. But alcohol, if enjoyed rightly, the Bible's pro it. Sex is the same. I mean, sex can really hurt you, can't it? There's all sorts of terrible things that can be done to people sexually, abusively. And that's an awful thing. But sex used rightly is a beautiful thing. And if God is the creator, it's not like, you know, he gave us these bodies and we suddenly discovered that you could have sex. I mean, he invented sex. God is pro good things in the world, sex and wine and relationships and fun and parties. And Jesus turned water into wine. And so I want to say to you right away tonight, if you're agnostic because you're just trying to keep the whole thing at bay for fear it might be awful, you don't need to. Jesus is really good news. But it might be you're saying, well, okay, I mean, I'm open to the possibility that Jesus is good news, but how could I actually be sure? And that's what I want to spend most of our time on tonight. How could you be sure about Jesus? Because aren't these just impossibly large philosophical questions? You know, who am I in the universe? How did I get here? Was there a Big Bang? Is there a God? What's the future? Are we all going to just run out of fossil fuels and then eventually the Earth will just go cold? Or will we collide with the sun? Or will Putin press the nuclear red button and Biden presses the other nuclear red button and then we all disappear in a thermonuclear explosion? I mean, how does it all end? And how do I know? And is there a God? And where's my future? And these are massive questions, aren't they? Well, I want to read you a paragraph from the New Testament from the Bible that's written by a friend of Jesus, the Apostle John, to some Christians in the first century. It's a short paragraph, but I think it is an extraordinary paragraph, and I think it will surprise you. I'm going to read it first, and then I'm going to explain why it's so surprising. Okay, so here we go. That which was from the beginning, in other words, the beginning of the universe, the beginning of everything, which we've heard, which we've seen with our eyes, which we've looked on, and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared. We've seen it. We testify to it. We proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and has appeared to us. We proclaim to you that which we've seen and heard, so that you also may have fellowship with us. Our fellowship is with God the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. We write this to suck all of the joy out of your life. No, it doesn't say that. We write this to make our joy complete. Now, there's a paragraph in the Bible. It is very surprising, I think, because it combines two things that by themselves are pretty common, but that never go together. One thing that's pretty common is philosophizing, people talking about ultimate questions, questions of life, questions of human identity, questions of God. You get that all over the place. I live in London, quite close to an art gallery called the White Cube, which I rather enjoy going to, and they always have something crazy on there. And just before the pandemic, I went to see an exhibition of 350 paintings by the German artist Peter Dreyer. Each one measured 10 by 8 inches. Each one depicted the same empty glass of water. And in fact, Peter Dreyer has painted this glass of water almost daily since the mid-1970s. I mean, that's amazing, isn't it? You can imagine he gets up in the morning and his wife says, "So what are you up to today, Peter?" "Oh, I don't know. I thought I might paint that glass of water again and then see what I do with the rest of my day." And these are amazing pictures. I mean, they weren't just sketches. They were, I mean, it's quite complicated to paint a glass of water. You know, you've got all of the refraction of the light coming into the window at a slightly different angle to how it did yesterday because of the changing weather. And, you know, he did it very, very accurately, but nonetheless, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of identical pictures. And then almost more interesting than the pictures themselves were what the blurb from the gallery then says. You know, Peter Dreyer shows that there can be great fullness even in an empty glass. And I'm sure they're very pleased with that line. But, you know, philosophy, what does it all mean? What fullness can I find in a glass of water? That's common. Any art gallery, they're asking questions like this, not to mention the books of In the Shelves of Waterstones. Another kind of literature that's pretty common is this one. Last night, went to the Stag and Lantern, had a pint, pretty good. That was my stepbrother Thomas's Facebook feed. He lives in Hyams Park in northeast London. He went to a microbrewery called the Stag and Lantern, had a pint of their latest IPA and was impressed by it. People writing what they did on Facebook is normal. Maybe tomorrow you, Bert, went to an online thing by this church with a bald bloke talking about agnosticism. I mean, maybe you do. It's just normal to say about your day and what happened. But what you never have, what you never find is those two kinds of literature combined. You would never say, "Hey, you'll never guess what happened at the Stag and Lantern last night. Eternity walked in." And what would that even mean? It was someone with a weird first name. But you see, what John is saying is exactly that for him, the biggest philosophical questions in the universe, the nature of the origins of everything, the nature of life itself, for him, those questions were answered in a person that he met, in fact, that he knew very well. Jesus had traveled in his fishing boat, him and his brother's fishing boat, many times. They traveled all over Israel together for 3 years. And he's now saying, I have met life itself. I have met the one who was from the beginning, the very creator of everything. I know because I saw him, I touched him, I heard him. Now, this is an extraordinary thing to say because it's not like John is just some sort of, you know, Rastafarian or some sort of New Ager who enjoys taking magic mushrooms and then hallucinating. I mean, John is an ordinary bloke, a Jewish fisherman, and as a Jew, he believes there's one God who's the creator of everything, who's eternal, who's infinite. And then he gets convinced that the person he took on fishing trips is God. That which was from the beginning, which we've heard, which we've seen with our eyes, which we've looked at and touched with our hands, he says. Now, I want you to think about this. I know it's in the Bible and that you're kind of used to the Bible being a bit religious stuff, but just think about what he's actually saying here. I've been speaking for, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes or so. That is enough time already for you to have concluded that I am not God. Am I right? I don't think anyone on this call, on this video, is thinking maybe this person speaking is the creator of the universe. Like, I'm not, right? I mean, my chemistry wasn't that impressive. But just imagine, what would it take to persuade you that somebody with whom you had spent not just 30 minutes, but 3 years of your life in close proximity, and at the end of that to concluded, I think my friend made the universe. In fact, I'm sure he did. I mean, what would it take to persuade you of that? It's not the kind of conclusion you reach quickly. But John reaches this conclusion because of the extraordinary things that Jesus does and says. Going to a wedding, turning water into wine. Meeting a man who's born blind and then opening his eyes so that he can see. And by the way, I know there's all sorts of fake miracle stories around nowadays. You know, somebody hobbles into a signs and wonders crusade and then waltzes out saying, I'm healed, I'm healed. And, you know, you can slip someone a tenner and say, do you mind pretending to be an actor and coming in hobbling and then walking out leaping? And someone says, sure, you know, split the profits with me. I don't know how people do these things, but I suspect some of them are fake. But this isn't a fake one. This is a guy who's been blind for his entire life. I mean, how do you fake that? Excuse me, do you mind pretending never to be able to see and fooling even your parents, and then in 30 years time I'll come along and heal you? I mean, you can't fake that kind of thing. And it's very difficult, isn't it, to magic that kind of evidence out of nowhere, because of course all the people who live in the town where this blind man lives, they know if it's real or not. Or Jesus goes to a funeral and raises the corpse from the dead. And Jesus meets a man who's been paralyzed for 38 years, and everybody knows him in the town. And then he heals him and he's walking home. I mean, these are difficult things to fake. And John sees them with his eyes and concludes, I've met God. And if you ask him at the end, John, how sure are you about this? You know, are you 50% sure? Are you 60%? No, he's 100% sure. You see, because meeting a person is much more objectively knowable than just a philosophical question. You know, if I ask, what is the nature of life? You've got one answer, and your Hindu friend's got another answer, and your Muslim friend's got another answer. There's lots of answers on the shelves of Waterstones. But if you ask, you know, did you meet a bald bloke with a bicycle behind him on his wall, talking about agnosticism? I mean, okay, this is a video, so you don't know for sure that it's real. But you know, imagine I'd actually met you, and you saw my bald head, and you know, I put my bicycle with me. This is not a virtual background; it's really there. And then you would be sure about that, wouldn't you? It's not a matter of, oh, I'm 50% sure. No, this actually happened to me. Things that happened in your day, you can be sure about. And for John, who writes this bit of the Bible, questions of eternity are something that happened to him. He met the man who he said is life. I used to be very skeptical about miracles when I was an atheist. I was from a science background, as I've mentioned, and I thought, well, miracles are just scientifically impossible, therefore they didn't happen. But I'd never really noticed that I'd smuggled in some presuppositions there that controlled my thinking. It was a kind of circular argument. I said, I know there's not a God, and given there's not a God, there couldn't be miracles. And given the Bible says there are miracles, the Bible's lying. That was my logic. But what if I was wrong about my premise? You know, what if there is a God? What if there's a God of such power that he made this universe? He made you and he made me. And the extraordinary technology that we are enjoying right now, where I'm speaking to a little screen in Greenwich and you're watching somewhere else in the world and hearing my words, and you can understand my words because you've got a brain that puts language together. And this is extraordinary. And all of this is because of the God who made us and gives us life and breath and everything. And if that God really wanted to get our attention, well, what better way than to step into the world as a real human being and then do some very unusual things? And when John says that which was from the beginning, which we've heard, which we've seen with our eyes, which we've looked at, and our hands have touched concerning the word of life, I think John is talking about one particular miracle that Jesus did. And you've probably heard of it. It's a famous one. It's the resurrection of Jesus, combined with the encounter that he has with a man called Thomas, and he's often called Doubting Thomas because of this incident. But for the purposes of this evening, I'm going to call him Agnostic Thomas. Thomas, he sees Jesus executed by the Romans by crucifixion on the Friday. And then he hears rumors on the Sunday that Jesus has come back from the dead. And he says, I can't believe that. And I'd like to believe it. I thought Jesus was a hero, but, I saw him be killed. I can't believe that. I can't believe that he's back. I wouldn't believe it unless, Thomas famously says, I can put my fingers in the marks where they put the nails in. So when they crucified Jesus, there were nails driven through his wrists. Thomas says, I want to put my finger in there. And then in his side, when Jesus died, the centurion checked that Jesus was dead by spearing him in his side. I want to examine the wound. And when you think about it, this is actually very good evidence, because by touching somebody, you can be sure whether they're alive or not, whether it's just a corpse or a living human being. But by asking to touch particularly these scars, Thomas is asking to verify that the one who is alive is the same as the one who was killed. He's verifying that he was killed and that he's alive again. And then John narrates in his biography of Jesus how exactly this happens. Jesus appears to Thomas, and Jesus invites him to perform this rather gruesome examination. If you're a fan of art, modern art, you can go to the White Cube. But if you're a fan of older art, I urge you to look at Caravaggio's painting, The Incredulity of Saint Thomas. And you can just search for it on Google Images. And it shows a painting. It's not a sort of fairy tale religious painting with Jesus with a halo. It's a very visceral, gory painting with Jesus standing there and Thomas like peering in to the wound in his side, just checking that it's really there. And that, I suggest, is very strong evidence. If John sees that, if he's there when Thomas does that examination, he is now sure. You see, if the truth is a person, then we can be sure about it. Those who were there were certain about it. We don't need to be agnostic. So I want to suggest you shouldn't want to be agnostic, because Jesus is good news. He's not out to wreck your life, to suck the joy out of your life. But you don't need to be agnostic, because the truth is a person. He is knowable. And then finally, and more briefly, I want to say that it's not actually safe to be agnostic. It's dangerous to be agnostic. I just want to read on the next little thing that John says in his letter. He says this is the message we've heard from him and declare to you. And then he summarizes the Christian message in 11 words. God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. That's the Christian message. God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. Now, this actually is quite a profound thing about God, because light in the Bible stands for what is good, and darkness stands for what is evil. And it's saying that God is only good and there is no evil in him. Now, this is quite different, actually, from lots of conceptions of God. If you go to the Eastern religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, then you have that yin-yang symbol. Maybe you know the swirly black and white symbol. And there's a swirl of dark in the middle of the bright, and a spiral of bright in the middle of the dark. And it's kind of saying good and evil, they're two different sides of the same coin. And God is everything. God is the good as well as the bad. God is the true as well as the false. Everything is God. God is everything. That's the Eastern religions. And John disagrees. He says, no, I've learned from Jesus that God is only light and no darkness. He's only good. There is no evil in him. And actually, that's a challenge, because all of us are mixed. It's not that you're entirely darkness, but also there are things in your life, I'm sure, as there are in mine, that are shady, that you wouldn't want other people to see. I used to live in a house in East London with one of those original energy-saving light bulbs. You know, the kind you turn the light on and it's absolutely pitch black still. The light bulb is slightly glowing, and after 10 minutes it's sort of slightly more glowing, but it's still quite dark. And I looked fantastic in that bathroom. I can never understand why, people, A-list celebrities, would want to go around with thousands of watts of like that, where you can see every blackhead and my coffee yellowed teeth. I prefer the the dim lighting. Why would you want to come before Jesus when he shows everything up? Even though Jesus is good and he does amazing miracles and he loves people, and he was very uncomfortable to be around because Jesus was always calling people out on their hypocrisy, pointing out the shady things that people were trying to keep hidden from him that he knew all about. And here's the problem. If there is a God who is entirely good and we are mixed, then there's a problem when we come before him and we get exposed by the light. And basically we get a choice. And this is how John goes on. There's two things that you can do. If we claim to have friendship with God and walk in the darkness, we lie and do not live out the truth. So, you can say, I think things are between me and God are just okay. They're just fine. And you're lying. You're deceiving yourself. Or if we walk into the light as he's in the light, we have fellowship with one another. And the blood of Jesus, his son, purifies us from all sin. If we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, he's faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. So here are the options. Number one, you can pretend that everything's okay with God, even though it's not, and you're just self-deceived. Or you can come to Jesus and he will cleanse you and forgive you, and you can be ready to come into the light. That's the Christian message. God is light. You can pretend that you're fine, even though you're in darkness, or you can say you're not fine and come to Jesus for forgiveness. I want to give an analogy and then I'm done. Imagine I go to the doctor one day. I've got some headaches. And the doctor does some tests and says, I'm very sorry, Dr. Sach, but it's very bad news. You've got a brain tumor. If we take action immediately, do some surgery and then some radiotherapy, there's a good chance that you could survive, but we must act now. And I don't like this news very much from the doctor, and I kind of feel okay. And I get home to Greenwich and I ask my next door neighbour, Anne, who lives just through that wall, and she's very friendly. I say to Anne, how do I look? She says, you look great, Andrew. Oh, thanks, Anne. I feel great. The doctor said that I had this real problem, but I don't think you can trust doctors these days. She goes, well, you never can be too careful, can you? And then what do I do at that point? I've got a choice, haven't I? I can either pretend everything's okay, even though it's not, or I can take the medical treatment and go and begin the surgery and the radiotherapy. But what would an agnostic do? I haven't decided about the doctor. Don't know whether the doctor's telling the truth. So I delayed the appointment. I feel okay most of the time. Sometimes I have headaches. I delayed the appointment a bit more. And the weeks go by and the months go by and the tumour grows. And then I'm in incurable trouble. And I use that analogy to illustrate that it's not actually possible to be neutral with respect to Jesus, because he's telling us something really serious, that God is light. In him there is no darkness at all, but we're mixed. There's shady things. There's things in your life that you don't want other people to know about, that you don't want to come out into the light. And you can either pretend everything's okay, or you can come to Jesus to get forgiven and to get cleansed and to be ready for the day that you meet God. But you can't really do neither. There's not a neutral option between those two. And to wait and indefinitely put it off, to sit on the fence, is actually to decide to ignore the treatment and face the sickness untreated. So we shouldn't want to be agnostic because Jesus is really good news. We don't need to be agnostic because the truth is a person and he's knowable and you can be sure about a person. And thirdly, it's not safe to be agnostic. There's not a neutral ground on which you can stand. Hey, thank you so much for listening. I presume you're still there. I'm just still talking to my laptop, but I hope you are. And there'll be questions in a moment. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andrew. And thanks for being willing to stay around and answer a few questions. We're going to put those questions to Andrew in a minute about some of the things that he said. As I mentioned earlier, there should be a link on the screen or in the YouTube description. You can use that to submit questions. You can do it anonymously. We've got a few questions already. Just before we put those questions to Andrew, let me mention a few other events coming up. I said earlier, tonight's event is the first of a series of events that we're running over the next 2 weeks. And I mentioned already we'll be back on Thursday night, 8 p.m. online. But if you're watching this from Portsmouth or near Portsmouth, you might not be, but if you are, we have an in-person event coming up next Thursday, the 14th of April. Jason Marriner will be coming to share his life story. Jason is someone who was involved in organized crime. He led a fairly destructive life, and now his life is very different. He's come to believe the things about Jesus that we've been hearing about tonight. And he's going to share his story with us about how and why his life was transformed. And everyone is welcome to join us. It's happening at the Deep Blue restaurant on the South Parade Pier. Again, details are on the screen on the website. Also, after Easter, we're going to be running a course over 7 weeks, a course called Christianity Explored. It's designed for people who want to find out more about Christianity and the claims of Jesus. Each week, there'll be a video to watch, and we'll read part of the Bible, and there'll be a chance to discuss it. You don't need to agree with it. You can ask any questions you want about it, or you don't need to say anything at all. Just sit and listen. You don't need to commit yourself for the whole 7 weeks either. Just come for the first week, try it out, and see if that is helpful for you. Final thing to say, we would appreciate your feedback, your questions, your comments about this event, or maybe you want to know more about some of the things that you've heard tonight, or maybe you want some more information about the events that I've just very quickly mentioned. We've got a feedback form, and again, it should be on the screen. You can do all of that on the feedback form. There'll be a link again in the description on YouTube. Please get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you, whether it's a comment or a question, or you want to know more information. Right now, we're going to take a 2-minute break before we put some questions to Andrew. Feel free to use that time to submit more questions, or use that time to fill in the feedback form if you like. There'll be a timer on the screen, and at the end of that 2 minutes, we'll be right into the questions. See you in 2 minutes. Welcome back. Hi, Andrew. Thanks again for sharing that with us, and thanks for staying around for the questions. We've got a few questions. Maybe we start with this one. If God is real, why are there so many agnostics?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think we can decide what's true just by democracy, because you just look at certain times in history where lots and lots of people were wrong. So, you know, a majority of people in the Nazi regime turned a blind eye, at least, to, if not actively joined into, the extermination of Jews. That wasn't a good thing to do, but it was by majority would have passed. Or I don't know what percentage of Russians support the war in Ukraine. I mean, it's, you know, there are people who are kind of crushed by a tyrant, but nonetheless, you can't decide just by a majority always. Yeah, there was a time when most people in the world thought that, well, everyone in the world thought that the sun orbited the earth, and then Copernicus thought otherwise and was persecuted partly by the church and by everybody, and he was right. So we can't just follow most people. You've got to find out for yourself what's right. It's worth saying that, you know, over 1 billion people in the world do think Jesus is God. So it's not a tiny minority. It's a huge number now, but it started off as a very small number. Just, you know, a handful of followers who were persecuted. So that's one answer. The other answer is the Bible says that we're hiding from God rather than searching for God. And you might find that quite offensive because maybe you think that you're searching for God, but Jesus disagrees, and he tells the story of a shepherd who goes looking for lost sheep, and when he finds one, he brings it home rejoicing, saying, "Rejoice with me, I've found my lost sheep." And I remember one of my friends said, "Oh, really? We need to update this story because, of course, we really know it's sheep looking for a lost shepherd. You know, where is that shepherd? Where's Jesus gone hiding to?" And Jesus, no, it's not that way around. It's we're hiding and he's looking. And I certainly know that was true of myself. And all I can say is autobiographically that's true. You know, I was at university. I kind of had the suspicion that maybe there was a God. I just didn't really want there to be one. And as I said before, I thought he might, you know, wreck my life or suck the joy out of my life. And I was just trying to find any excuse to keep him at bay. And it was only God's persistence in going after me, I think, in the end that turned me back to him. So I think there's a lot of agnostics because a lot of people are hiding. And if we're honest with ourselves, we're not quite ready to find him because we're scared or for whatever other reason. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. Maybe you could just to say a bit more about yourself and your story. There's a question about what was the thing that convinced you. You talked about changing your position from an atheist. What was the thing that convinced you?
Oh, it was a lot of different things, and it was a bit of a mess, to be honest. I'm not sure I'd say that I was a model case, but what the thing that I dismissed about Christianity was I thought I never was this rude to their face, but I thought Christians were gullible hypocrites. I thought they were gullible because I'd never heard anyone give me a reason why I should believe it. And I thought they were hypocrites because I read the papers. You know, I knew about the paedophile priest scandals and embezzlement by vicars and, you know, all this stuff. And I just thought it's all fake. And when I went to Cambridge, I met some Christians who were neither of those things. They weren't gullible. They were very thought through, and they'd engage seriously with history and science and philosophy. And that was interesting. They're intelligent people with intelligent reasons. And I'd always used to think that faith was the sort of thing you did when there was no evidence. You know, you just take a leap in the dark. And I now realize that the word faith in the Bible is just a word for trust. And a rational person trusts things that are trustworthy with good reasons for it. And actually, the Christians were never asking me to trust something without giving me reasons. So that was one thing. And then the other thing, they weren't hypocrites. So I just met Christians who had real integrity and lived in a way that was very different and very attractive. And that didn't make it true, but it was enough for me not to dismiss it so quickly. So that was sort of stage one. And then I started discovering that there was real historical evidence for Jesus. He wasn't just a stained glass window artist's concept, but a real person who really lived, and that I could get access to people who were there at the time who'd met him and written about him. So started reading some of the history, the eyewitnesses. And at the same time, sort of philosophically, I was doubting Christians to start with, but then I realized that it wasn't enough just to stand over here and sort of accuse them. I also had to stand over here and work out what is the ground that I'm standing on. And it wasn't just enough to examine Christian beliefs. I had to examine my own atheist beliefs. And it was a combination, I guess, of finding my atheism had really very little foundation at all. I don't think atheism is very coherent philosophically. And at the same time, Christianity was enormously coherent, and Jesus was very persuasive. And I thought it's probably true. And then the last thing for me was, I think it's true, and I don't want it to be true because I think Jesus wants to wreck my life. And so the reason I kept hiding, actually, quite a long time after I thought it was probably right, was just this fear that I couldn't trust Jesus with my life. Because trusting someone with your life is more than just conceptually believing that they are true. You have to know that they're really good and that you want to put your life in their hands. It's like getting married, isn't it? You don't just go, yes, I affirm that this woman exists. You want to know, do I trust her? Can I share my life with her? And it was that kind of decision with Jesus. And I was a bit slower coming to that, to think he's not just true, but he's also good. So it's all those sorts of things in a bit of a muddle.
Can you just say a bit more about, you mentioned that the Christians gave you good reasons to trust Christianity. There's a question about, you quoted from the Bible. Why can we trust the Bible? I mean, that you're basing a lot of the things you said from there. Why should we trust the Bible?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good question, and it really ought to be another evening, I guess, on that question. But just a couple of things today. One is the Bible isn't a book, actually. It's an anthology of books. It's a collection of books. So when in the ancient world, there were no such thing as books. There were just scrolls. And, you rolled up a bit of parchment, like wallpaper. And then when you got to the end of it, you had to stop. So there was a sort of maximum length that you could make a scroll. And then when people invented books, someone had the idea of stitching pages down the middle and you could turn pages. We're used to that now. It suddenly became possible to have much, much longer documents. And someone then began to collect together lots of different relevant scrolls and say, wouldn't it be handy to have them all in one place? So the Bible actually is a collection of the relevant scrolls. And there's two halves of it. There's the bit written before Jesus, the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament. And then there's the bit written after Jesus, which are biographies of him and letters written by early Christians, like the one that I quoted from. But actually, the Bible is, whoever invented books and put it all together has just made our life easier because they've collected together in one place all of the relevant historical material about Jesus. So sometimes people say, well, look, give me some evidence for Jesus outside the Bible. And yeah, there is a little bit, but it's a bit like saying, give me all the evidence outside the place where they collected together all the relevant evidence. And the point is they did a really good job in collecting the relevant evidence. So I'd say don't think of the Bible as one thing. Think of it as there's a whole collection here of first century documents written by people who knew him and followed him and staked their life on it. So there's a lot of suspicion, isn't there, about the church nowadays, and probably rightly, that some churches are some denominations are very wealthy. The Catholic Church is very wealthy. The Church of England is pretty wealthy. And maybe we're suspicious about the church and power and so on. But the early Christians weren't very wealthy and they weren't powerful. They were marginalized. They were persecuted. Some of them were killed. And they wrote this stuff and died for it because they were so sure about it. So I think, there's not a lot in it for them. It's not like they made up a religion and then benefited hugely. They wrote honestly, I think, what happened to them and what happened to Jesus, and staked their life on it. And there's more you could go into. There's a lot of things that they report that you wouldn't include if you were making it up. So in the first century, Israel was occupied by the Romans, an occupied country, and people despised the Romans, and they had to pay taxes to the Roman occupiers. And people asked Jesus, should we pay taxes? And famously, he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. And he basically told people, if you've got a Roman coin with Caesar's head on it, give it to Caesar. This was not the popular answer. People wanted a revolutionary leader. Jesus was not that. He refused to be a political revolutionary. Or, another example would be, it's important for all movements that they have credible leaders. We know all from the wranglings in our own government. You want to know, can I trust the leader? The leader of the early church was Peter. And Peter, in the eyewitnesses, is revealed as being a real coward. And at the end of Jesus' life, when Jesus is being arrested, Peter is ashamed to say he even knows him because he's too scared of the consequences. And he doesn't come out of it well at all. And again, they're not writing it a sort of airbrushed version in which they look fantastic. And then number 3, Jesus is crucified, which is a massive problem for in the first century, because Jews believe that if you're hung on a tree, then God has cursed you. So says the Jewish scriptures. And Romans think that if you're hung on a tree, you're a criminal. and you're weak. And so don't give people a Messiah who's hung on a tree. The Jews aren't going to accept it, and the Greeks aren't going to accept it. It's like and we know actually from a piece of graffiti in the 3rd century, there's a picture of Jesus with a donkey's head on a cross and a Christian bowing before him. And the inscription underneath says, Alexamenos worships his God. And it's just making fun, how stupid of Alexamenos worshipping somebody who got crucified. And so don't make that up. Why would you make up something that is such a barrier to belief? And then Jesus' resurrection, I mean, that's an amazing thing. But all the witnesses of the resurrection in the Gospels are women, the first witnesses. And that's fine in our culture because we're enlightened. But in first century culture, it's very sexist and they didn't really take women's testimony seriously. So if you're making it up, don't make the witnesses people that no one's going to listen to. So there's just all sorts of things that seem to me very honest about it, that you could do better if you wanted to fool people. Why would you write it like that? And it's just a kind of very plain speaking. Not to mention that, as I say, they get persecuted for it. And certainly people are willing to die for a lie. I think it's a lie that if you fly an aeroplane into a skyscraper, you go to a paradise full of virgins. But I'm sure that the people who did that thought that it was true, as in the Islamic terrorist on 9/11 thought it was true. You give your life for a lie as long as you believe it. You definitely don't give yourself your life for a lie that you know is a lie. And I think the thing about the early Christians is they were in a position to know. And I think it's only rational to understand their own sacrifice if they at least really believed it was true. So, that doesn't mean, and there's lots more I could say about why you trust the Bible, but this is the closest access you're going to get to people who actually knew, met, heard Jesus. Why not start there? I mean, of course, read it critically. I'm not saying throw your brain away, but why not have a read and say, what did convince John that his friend who got in his fishing boat was actually the creator of the universe? I mean, what happened to him? That's at least an interesting question. So just at least start there and see how you go.
Thanks, that's helpful. Just 2 more questions, I think. One question, talking about presuppositions. I think the question is, you would say that perhaps atheists are starting from the premise that there is no God, and that sort of informs everything they think. But are you not just saying the opposite? You're saying, well, we just need to start with the premise that there is a God, and that informs everything that I think. And so why is that any better than the other position?
It may not be any better, but I just want everyone to realize that there's no neutrality. So I think sometimes atheists think I'm neutral. Why should I opt into your Christianity? And I want to say you're not neutral. You started with presuppositions, as I have. So no one has no presuppositions. And I just want to ask you, I suppose, whether you're willing to examine your presuppositions and experiment with the idea that there could be different ones. Now, I'm not saying, suddenly just accept all my presuppositions, but you got to kind of do both. So I could step into your atheism, in fact, which is where I used to be myself, and say, let me imagine myself as an atheist and look around and see how the world looks from over here. And I think there's a lot of problems. So as an atheist, why do we exist at all? And I don't just mean evolution. I mean, why does the universe in which evolution happens exist? Why did the Big Bang go bang? Why did the Big Bang go bang at exactly the right rate, such as planets are possible? Where did the DNA come from that built even the first self-replicating cell before you could even have a process like Darwinian evolution at all? And how do you get from a single-celled ancestor to a self-conscious human being processing language, which is way further, I think, than the biologists can explain? There's massive problems like that. There's also a problem about your own rationality. I mean, if your brain is just a randomly assembled collection of atoms, why should you trust what your brain says? I mean, it's just there by accident, and it's not designed to tell you truth. And why should you think that good and evil are any more than random numbers? And why should you object to a strong nation like Russia crushing a weak nation like Ukraine? I mean, isn't that how you think we came about? The survival of the fittest, the weak being supplanted by the strong. So why object to it? That's just normal, isn't it? But I think there's loads of problems in atheism, but that's sort of within the atheism worldview. There's another worldview. There's a worldview where there's a God who made us, and where the reason we're here is because he is a wonderful, powerful creator. He made us the way he wanted us to be. And good and evil are not the same, because God loves good and hates evil, and there's no darkness in him. And it isn't okay to crush people and to have a genocide in the streets of outside Kiev. That's not okay, because the God who's the judge of the world hates that. And so just, we've got different presuppositions, but you've got to kind of, are you willing to acknowledge there could be another set of presuppositions to the ones that you currently have? And I'm not saying just believe mine because I tell you to, but you might want to step outside of yours to look at the world from over here. And does this world make more sense than this world? And which one makes sense? The data. The trouble is, if you just start with your presuppositions and you look at everything through that lens, you just say, there is no God, I'm an atheist, therefore Jesus didn't rise from the dead, therefore miracles are impossible, therefore QED. But all you've really done is taken your presuppositions and held on to them in the face of the evidence. And I'm saying, what if you were wrong about the very framework in which you're evaluating this? And there is a God, and that would make, it's at least possible, if there's a God, that he could come to earth and that he might do some miracles. And are you open-minded to that? So I'm not saying just trust me. I'm saying don't pretend that there's a neutral. That's all.
Thanks, Andrew. I think one more question. It's a big question, and you could have a whole evening on this question as well. But I think it's important we maybe ask it. I think one reason people might question the things that you said, you talked about, we can trust that Jesus is good, but what about suffering? Because I think the suffering that people see in the world probably will be one reason that people might think actually God isn't good, and perhaps they would reject some of the things that you said. Can you maybe just say a couple of things about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a massive question, and again, let me just say a couple of things. I mean, I'd love to talk much more about this because it is a big topic, but firstly, atheism doesn't help you any more than Christianity on this. If you're an atheist, suffering is random numbers, and that's all. You don't even get to ask why. It doesn't make sense to ask why of random numbers. They're just random. What is suffering? It's just the decrease of the concentration of a neurotransmitter in the randomly assembled collection of atoms, which is your brain. It just doesn't matter. I think atheism ends up trivializing suffering. And I think the Bible doesn't. The Bible takes suffering very seriously. And the Bible extraordinarily presents us with a God who is familiar with suffering, because Jesus himself suffered terribly on the cross. But let me say this other thing just to finish. One of the interesting things, sorry, for me to finish, this isn't the end of the topic, it's a big topic, but a final comment we've got time for. One of the weird things you notice as you meet Christians who've suffered is that people who suffered the most are often agnostic the least. And I just present that to you as an observation, but I can think of some. I mean, I went to see some friends last week who had a child a couple of years ago who's very, very severely disabled, and life is a real struggle, in every way. He can't feed himself, he can't, etc., and probably never will, and it's really, really difficult. And this couple is full of thankfulness to God for his kindness to them, and maybe you think that is just very mysterious because it doesn't seem to make sense, and yet I mean, the Bible presents great hope for those who are suffering, because the Bible says the world is suffering because the world's gone horribly wrong in a way that was not intended by its good creator. And the whole story of Jesus' plan is how to fix the world, and Christians are really sure that Jesus can fix it. And so, we're not like looking at the world now and saying, oh, it's so wonderful. We're so rose tinted that we've failed to realize that there's awful things in the world. I mean, of course, there are terrible, terrible things, but there is this real confidence that Jesus can sort it out and that he's good. And I mean, that's my sort of short, silly answer. But when you meet Christians who have suffered, I put it to you that they are often very sure of God's kindness to them and secure in their hope that he'll fix the world. And without Jesus, you've got nothing. You've just got a world that's broken, that's going to get worse. I mean, what is your ultimate hope as an atheist? One day, the heat death of the universe. That's basically your only future. Whereas the Christian has a confident future and a resurrection day and a day of salvation and God making all things new. So, but there's much more to say. I don't want to suggest that we can dismiss this with a few lines.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks so much for answering the questions. Thanks to those who submitted the questions. And let me just
especially Ken from Singapore at 3 a.m. That's quite impressive.
It is. Yeah, just want to say thanks so much for being here, and for those who are still watching, or if you're watching this later. It would be great if your question wasn't answered, or if you've got a different question that you want to ask, or you want more information about what we said. Do check out the video description on YouTube, and you'll be able to find the feedback form. You can fill that in. Get in touch with us. We'd love to help you. And don't forget, we'll be back again Thursday night, same time, 8 o'clock, thinking about is satisfaction possible? Thanks for joining us tonight, and hope to see you on Thursday.